Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. Welcome to the realm of Misty's Histories. So, just to let you know, my name is Misty, and I am a history lover throughout all the ages. I go everywhere from the Romans to the Greek mythology to medieval England to American Revolution and everything in between and then some. These are just some of the stories that I found very interesting and very entertaining, and I felt why not share them with everyone. Just as a warning, as with many stories throughout history, this story does contain acts of violence. If you are uncomfortable with that, please do not continue watching. Otherwise, I hope that you enjoy the story. Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's episode The French Failure, Charlesfort, and Fort Caroline, Part 2. Just to recap our first part of the story, the French charged Captain Jean Ribault, who was a Protestant, with exploring what is today the southeast coast of the United States, establishing a French settlement, and, of course, helping to prosper France within the New World. They would start Charlesfort, which would be a failure and end badly. Once Charlesfort has failed, they would attempt again at Fort Caroline. My focus has been primarily on Fort Caroline, but as I stated before, you cannot tell the story of Fort Caroline without telling the story of Charlesfort first. One would not have existed without the other. And with that being said, we are now at Fort Caroline. It has been over a year, and the French have had no reinforcements from their king in France. However, an English captain named John Hawkins would stumble upon their little settlement. He would give them very much help and has agreed to give them supplies, take very little payment, and has shown himself to be a very good man. The French have finally decided to go home. They expressed their eagerness to do this with him, and that was why he was so willing to help these people out. As of right now, there is a question that I had asked at the end of our last episode. Was the help that came from Captain John Hawkins considered a blessing or a curse for the French settlers? This will be what you will need to decide at the end of this episode. So, having the great supplies that came from Captain John Hawkins, they are quickly gathering everything they need and getting everything in order to return to France. Essentially, all they're really doing is waiting on a good wind to be able to leave. Meanwhile, Captain Jean Ribault has been released from English prison and he gets back to France and he's ordered by Admiral Coligny to go to Fort Caroline. Find out what's going on out there because I'm not hearing good things. And technically, these stories were coming from the mutineers that had stolen ships from Fort Caroline, so not sure where to go with that one. However, take them supplies and then explore the coast again so that we can set up another settlement. Ribault goes and begins preparations to leave. When he receives his written orders, though, there's a personal message that comes from Coligny, and it says, I received advice that Don Pedro Menendez has departed from Spain to go to the coast of New France. See that he does not encroach upon us any more than he would want you to encroach upon them. Well, this is basically telling him the Spanish are coming and they're gonna attack. I mean, this is considered a Protestant settlement, and the Spanish are fierce Catholics with an armada behind them. Just saying. Anyway, instead of going and taking the supplies and new soldiers directly to Fort Caroline, Captain Jean Ribault would spend 2 weeks exploring the coast instead of going directly to Fort Caroline. In my opinion, this was a very bad decision, should have never happened, and had he went straight to Fort Caroline, the following events would not have happened. However, this is all speculation. He would arrive at Fort Caroline on August 28, 1565. And in the midst of the celebrations of his return, the fresh supplies, the fresh soldiers, the visits from the natives who had remembered him from the years before, Spanish ships are seen off the coast on September 4th. After a small skirmish with the French ships that are still in the water, they would sail about 40 miles south. They would set up their own settlement and fort they would name San Augustine, or we know it today as St. Augustine. On September 8th, 1565, they would go on land and begin making their fort and settlement. The reason that we know this is because natives from the Timucuan village of Saloy had come to Fort Caroline and told the French of the Spanish landing and of the Spanish coming on land, taking their huts to house their slaves. Captain John Ribald is not having this. He wants to go directly to the source. Let's go get them while they're still in preparation. He knows they're going to attack Fort Caroline. He doesn't want to wait around. All he wants is for everyone to get in the ships and go after the Spanish. However, Laudonnière has essentially been doing everything by council and votes, really. But Ribald insists he is overriding everything now, and he decides, we're leaving, we're going. The day that Captain Ribald would sail out with his fleet would be the day that a hurricane would roll into the area. He would be taking the majority of the supplies and all of the healthy soldiers to go fight the Spanish. He has essentially now left Fort Caroline to be defended by sick and or wounded men, women, and children. Once he sails off into this hurricane, it would eventually separate and shipwreck his entire fleet. Because they are utterly defenseless, this would be the end of the French Fort Caroline. The Spanish, who have been setting up in their St. Augustine, have decided that they're not waiting any longer. They knew they couldn't attack by water, so they decided to march through the hurricane, the 40 miles from their settlement of St. Augustine to the French fort, Fort Caroline. And their objective, simply remove the Protestant threat. Some of the settlers would survive. However, when the Spanish attack at daybreak on September 20th, 1565, the majority of the French are still in their night clothes that are inside the fort. There were accounts of women and children being caught within the fighting, that they did die inside the fort. But in Pedro Menendez's letter to King Philip, he would tell King Philip that he spared women and children. This one is up for some debate. But there was an account by a 60-year-old carpenter that survived and made it back to France. He stated that the Spaniards committed a horrible execution, each trying to outdo the other in slaying. I would not find greater cruelty among wild beasts. And when you think about it, was it simply the fact that they thought that these were all Protestants? Or was it the fact that they had to march 40 miles through a hurricane and they're already upset? Not sure where their anger came from, but nonetheless, it was a horrible, bloody massacre. The ones who did escape would either seek shelter in the friendly native villages nearby, or they would make their way towards the ships that were going back to France anyway. René Laudonnière would escape. He would be struck by a pike from a Spanish soldier. However, he would make it to one of those ships and sail back to France. This is how we have his first-hand account, because he did survive. But those that would seek shelter with the friendly natives would return to the fort in the next few days to see what had happened. And unfortunately, Pedro Menendez has decided that he is not going to let any of them live, and they would immediately be killed. Now, some accounts suggest that this was written on a piece of paper and posted to a tree. Others suggest that it was carved into a tree. But Pedro Menendez would have this saying amongst those dead bodies: "This is done not as unto Frenchmen, but as unto Lutherans." He seems to be trying to justify what he is doing, why he is killing all these people. And with that, the Spanish would claim what was Fort Caroline and rename it San Mateo. And so on September 23rd, Pedro Menendez would leave what is now San Mateo with 50 soldiers. The rest are to stay behind to lay their claim to what was this French fort. He is returning to San Augustine because he needs to prepare for Ribault and his men. He has no idea that Ribault has been shipwrecked. On September 29th, Pedro Menendez would be alerted by some natives that there were men walking along near what is today the Matanzas Inlet. He would have an encounter with them, and it would turn out that they were some of the shipwreck survivors from Ribault's fleet. They're asking for safe passage to go back to their Fort Caroline. They have no idea that the fort's been taken. But Pedro Menendez is all too happy to tell them that it has been taken. They are asking for safe passage. They really have no weaponry to speak of. And unfortunately, they would surrender to him. And out of the roughly 140 of those shipwreck survivors, he would spare only 16. On October 12th, Captain Jean Ribault and the remainder of the shipwreck survivors are seen at the same inlet on the opposite side, trying to return to Fort Caroline, trying to negotiate for safe passage. This, unfortunately, Pedro Menendez would not allow. And of this roughly 70 shipwreck survivors, he would spare only 5. At this river inlet, which was once called the River of Dolphins by the French, has since become known as the Matanzas River, which is actually Spanish for slaughter or massacre. And the picture you see there is actually of a stone monument that was erected near the area where this killing occurred. But how do we know how this happened? So, we know this because, lo and behold, Pedro Menendez would write a letter to King Philip of Spain, and actually, this letter is dated October 15th, 1565. I referenced it earlier when I stated that Pedro Menendez told King Philip in the letter that he had spared women and children. However, the letter does not tell us what he did with those women and children. Laudonnière would later write that he believed they were taken to Havana, just like many who were captured by the Spanish. However, the quotes that you see on the screen are regarding his interactions with Ribault's shipwreck survivors. He tells King Philip of the first encounter. "I responded to him that we had taken their fort and cut the throats of those who were within. I would not give them passage, rather I would follow them on land or at sea until I took their lives. They could turn over their arms and put themselves under my mercy in order that I might do with them what our Lord might order me. And I had their hands tied behind them and put them to the knife. There only remained 16, of which 12 were Breton seamen, whom they had taken, and the 4 were craftsmen, carpenters and caulkers, people of whom I have need. And it seemed to me to punish them in this way would be serving God our Lord and your Majesty. These quotes come from his first interaction with the shipwreck survivors. But the quote at the bottom would be his encounter with Captain Jean Ribault and his part of the shipwreck survivors. I saved the lives of 2 young gentlemen of about 18 years of age and 3 others, the fifer, drummer, and trumpeter. I passed Jean Ribault and all the rest under the knife, understanding that thus it befitted the service of God our Lord and of your Majesty. I hold it to be a piece of very great fortune that this man be dead, because the King of France could do more with him with 50,000 ducats than others could do with 500,000. In his letter, it does seem to suggest that he believes he is doing God's work. He is a staunch Catholic, and these are Protestants. He feels he is doing the work of God and his king. And he also seems to have some sort of fear of Captain Ribault's abilities, stating that the King of France could essentially do more with him than many others. So how could they end up in this place and expect to survive? It seemed that no matter what they did, they had no chance of surviving their encounter with the Spanish. And no one wanted to go to war with Spain, and especially the King of France, King Charles, and the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici. At this time, Spain is an almighty empire with an armada that is hard to beat. And not to mention that at this time, the Queen of Spain is actually the King of France's sister, Elizabeth. So the odds of any kind of retaliation for these murders are slim to none by the crown. But one man has decided that this is too much cruelty and he is not putting up with it. A man named Dominique de Gourgues, who is a French Catholic. His story is intriguing. However, he actually does do this. Whether it was his idea or not is where I question things. But he has decided that he is going to strike a blow to the Spanish. It's also said that when he was younger, he was taken by the Spanish and forced into slavery for many years for them. And this may have been his way of getting some kind of payback for that as well. It would take him 3 years, but he would sell off everything he owned, borrow money, commit acts of piracy, do anything and everything he needed to do to completely fund an attack on San Mateo, what was Fort Caroline, all on his own. He would gather 180 crew members and sail off from France. When he gets to the New World in the area of where San Mateo is presently, the natives are very happy to see him. He's French. They like French. They are essentially telling him stories of the horrors and the unspeakable things that the Spanish have been doing to them and putting them through, and they want to join his fight. And so along with his 180 men and countless natives, they very easily take the fort of San Mateo, what was Fort Caroline. In his twisted way, he has decided that the men that he is killing inside this fort will have a posting near their bodies that states, "This is done not as unto Spaniards, but as unto liars, thieves, and murderers." After this, he knows that he cannot take St. Augustine. It's just too heavily guarded. And so he returns to France. When he gets there, the people, both Catholics and Protestants, have decided that they like what he's done, and they're hailing him a hero. However, King Charles and the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, are not as thrilled with what he's done. The Spanish ambassador, when he finds out about the attack, would actually come storming in at Catherine de' Medici and blame René Laudonnière for the attack, stating that he was just trying to get revenge for his failed settlement. But she would quickly put a stop to this and state, he couldn't fund an attack. He's so poor I had to lend him money. And so de Gourgues has to go into hiding, essentially. The Spanish have a price on his head. He's basically banished from court. Queen Elizabeth of England would pop in and offer him a place at the English court. This was essentially approving of what he has done, and he was considering it, from what we understand. However, when the King of France finds out about this, he is very quickly taken back into favor, and this doesn't come to be. But he would remain the only one to get some kind of revenge for the attack and massacre of the Fort Caroline settlers. The ship carrying Laudonnière and the other survivors from the Fort Caroline massacre had actually saw land near Swansea in England before returning to France. He would get some supplies, send the ships to France, but he would travel by land to London and meet with the French ambassador. It's also said that while he was there, he spoke with some of Queen Elizabeth's advisors, if not Queen Elizabeth herself, and that the English knew all about the massacre at Fort Caroline before the French king did. However, Laudonnière does not write this in his account, so it is up for speculation. We know what we know about the massacre of Ribault and his men from the letter that Pedro Menendez would write to King Philip II of Spain. In his letter, he would state that he knew of 8 or 10 babies that were born at Fort Caroline, and if this is true, this would mean that we had children of European descent being born within what is today the United States well before Virginia Dare at the lost colony of Roanoke. But for me, I feel this had been happening for many years before. We just don't have the written proof of it. Laudonnière himself would talk about having a meeting with these 2 men who visited a nearby native village that appeared to be Christian. When they tell him their story, it turns out that they were on a Spanish ship that had shipwrecked off of Key West 15 years earlier. They also said that they had integrated into the local native tribe there in order to survive. The women that were on that ship had actually become wives of members of that tribe. Very well possible. One other thing that comes from Pedro Menendez's letter is that he would tell King Philip he believed that the Queen of England and these French Lutherans, as he called them, were in league together to attack the Spanish holdings in the south, and that Captain Jean Ribault was going to be made admiral of the English fleet. And why did he think this? When they are taking inventory of what they had at Fort Caroline, Captain John Hawkins' ship was still there. And one of the survivors of the Ribault massacre that Pedro Menendez spared confirmed his theory. Why he would do this, I don't know, maybe he just was saying whatever he could to keep himself alive. However, we know that this was not true, but it was just something else that made Spain even more angry at England. De Gourgues' attack on what was Fort Caroline, San Mateo, would cause the Spanish to abandon the site, and they would not attempt any kind of settlement there until many, many years later. When I ended and began the first and second parts, I asked, what is your opinion? Will you make up your mind? Was the aid from Captain Hawkins considered a blessing or a curse? For me, telling this story, it is a domino effect. Charlesfort fails miserably. So then becomes Fort Caroline. Without Fort Caroline, without the Spanish finding the French at Fort Caroline, we would not have what my next episode is going to be all about. The oldest continuously inhabited European settlement within the continental United States, St. Augustine. I hope that you have enjoyed hearing this story. I do look forward to my next episode, which again, St. Augustine, or what they have deemed their slogan, the oldest city. Thank you so much.